Good evening, everyone. Good evening. And welcome. My name is Dr. Ed Peck, and I serve as the Vice President for University Mission and Identity here at John Carroll University. On behalf of the university and our President, Dr. Al Mikiak, I would like to welcome you to tonight's lecture and discussion, which is sponsored by the Tuohy Center for Interreligious Understanding and the Office of Mission and Identity. Exactly 60 years ago today, on October 28, 1965, over 2,000 bishops, united with the Pope and gathered in Rome for the final session of the Second Vatican Council, overwhelmingly approved Nostra Aetate, the declaration of the Church's relation to non-Christian religions. As you will learn tonight, this document was a turning point in the history of the Catholic Church's dealings with those of other faiths and no faiths, replacing centuries of condemnation with a new appreciation for the diverse religious traditions that shape our world. Moving from an emphasis on divisions and focusing instead on points of commonality and common purpose. The following year, in 1966, inspired by the ecumenical and interreligious openness of the Second Vatican Council, Walter and Mary Tuohy made a generous gift to John Carroll that would establish the first endowed chair at this university and the first chair of ecumenism at a Jesuit college or university in the United States, the Walter and Mary Tuohy Chair in Interreligious Studies. In 2023, under the leadership of Dr. Ed Hannenberg of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, the Tuohy Chair was reconfigured to establish the Tuohy Center for Interreligious Understanding in order to more fully embrace the call of Nostra Aetate to acknowledge, preserve, and encourage the spiritual and moral truths found in all religious traditions, and to bring a diversity of religious voices into mutually illuminating conversation. Tonight's gathering represents one of the many fruits of this initiative. At a time in history when it is becoming increasingly difficult to dialogue across difference or to address our disagreements in peaceful and constructive ways, efforts like these are essential to the work of a Jesuit Catholic university like John Carroll. This kind of dialogue is not a distraction, but rather an integral part of our mission. As JCU's Statement on Belonging puts it, in keeping with our Jesuit Catholic commitment to a faith that does justice, John Carroll University commits to a welcoming climate of inclusion, compassion, and respect through genuine encounters, solidarity, and care for the whole person. To help us through such an encounter, let me welcome our tonight's moderator, Dr. Mindy Peden, Professor of Political Science and Interim Director of JCU's Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Program, who will introduce our speakers. Mindy.
I am truly honored to have this role, so thank you, Ed. We are delighted this evening to welcome Dr. DrBorelli to campus to help us commemorate the 60th anniversary of Vatican II's Nostra Aetate, a document that did so much to open the Catholic Church to more positive engagement with other religions and other aspects of Christianity. Dr. Borelli brings a wealth of scholarly expertise and personal experience in the field of interreligious dialogue, about which I'll say more in just a minute. After Dr. Borelli offers his reflections on Nostra Aetate, I will invite two of my colleagues to join him on the stage. Dr. Noah Bickart, the Mandel Chair in Jewish Studies here at John Carroll, and Dr. Zeki Sertoprak, the Nursi Chair in Islamic Studies. We'll give them a chance to respond to Dr. Borelli from their own areas of expertise offering thoughts on the reception of Nostra Aetate among Jews and Muslims. After a little interreligious dialogue among the panelists, we'll open things up to your questions and comments. And so, without further ado, allow me to introduce our main speaker. Dr. DrBorelli has served as a special assistant for dialogue and Catholic identity to the president of Georgetown University since 2004, where he also serves as a senior research fellow for the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. His recent research, lecturing, and writing have focused on ecumenical and interreligious relations, and he is currently completing a comprehensive study on the genesis and development of Nostra Aetate. Prior to his years at Georgetown, Dr. Borelli was Associate Director of the U.S. Bishop's Secretariat for Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs for over 16 years, and served as Interim Director for 1 year. For 17 years, he was a consultor to the Vatican's Dicastery for Interreligious Dialogue. In these positions, for the past 38 years, he has developed projects emphasizing how dialogue is at the heart of Catholic identity, one of the key emphases of the Second Vatican Council, and has sponsored, staffed, participated in numerous ecumenical, interreligious, and multi-religious dialogues and projects. He has authored and edited 6 books and 250 articles and chapters on various topics in theology, religious studies, ecumenical, and interreligious relations. Clearly, we have with us someone who understands both the theory and the practice of interreligious understanding. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Borelli.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here tonight, and I want to thank Professor Edward Honenberg and Professor Zeki Saratoprek, who contacted me and whom I've known for a good many years, to give this lecture, and now realizing that it's a part of your history, this date and this event that happened at Vatican II and the developments here at John Carroll University. And also I want to thank Professors Noah Bickard and Professor Mindy Eden for your participation tonight. Now, I know that a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church has been here before, Cardinal Michael Fitzgerald, and has spoken here on a few occasions. Let's see, is this right? No, it's not. Oh, wrong way. There we go. So, there I am, Georgetown University. There's Pope Francis at an interreligious gathering. Cardinal Michael Fitzgerald. This was taken in 2019, October 5th, when he received his red hat from Pope Francis. I was there with him to celebrate this acknowledgement of interreligious relations by Pope Francis, and it was about time that he was made a cardinal. He was 82 at the time. He's saying to me, "Now, John, if you ever speak at John Carroll University, here's what you need to know." So he kind of had a premonition, I think, of what was to come. We are celebrating a document prepared in mid-20th century in another time and era in the minds of most people here tonight. 60 years after it was promulgated, as you said, on October 28th, today, by an ecumenical council of the Catholic Church that most Catholics alive today have only heard about as an important historic event and may have little interest to know more than that about it. We do have to say a little bit about Vatican II to get started, to explain what it is and why we are at this 60-year mark, still celebrating it, because it wasn't the only document of Vatican II. But the Church today, the Catholic Church today, the worshiping, engaged, and active community is the Church of Vatican II. Through our liturgy and our way of praying, our structure, our way of being church, where being synodal at all levels of church life is dialogical. just as is our ecumenical, our interreligious, and our social and public engagement should be as a global church. Vatican II convened the largest deliberative meeting ever, 2,500 deliberating bishops and heads of religious orders, over 4 fall terms, 1962 to 1965, mostly from the end of September to December 8th. So, briefly, Nostra Aetate made it to that agenda because of 3 80-year-old men. Pope John the 23rd, who called the council, the French Jewish historian Jules Isaac, who was received by Pope John at precisely the right time for this idea to pop into the Pope's consciousness, and Cardinal Augustin Bea, who maneuvered it through Vatican II. And here's what happened. On January 25th, 1959, Pope John the 23rd disclosed that he wanted to call a council to meet, and he identified 2 general reasons: the spiritual renewal of the Christian people and to invite the separated communities to seek again that unity for which so many souls are longing in these days throughout the world. Over time, a third reason was given by him: reconciliation of the church with the modern world. Later, Augustin Bea read this in Observatory Romano when it was announced. Augustin Bea, a Jesuit, a scholar of the Bible, especially the First Testament, the Jewish scriptures, and a well-respected elderly presence in Rome. He and John in 1915, actually in 1960, they were 78 this year in 59. They almost were 80-year-old men. And Bea had been retired from the Biblical Institute, but he was working for what we called the Holy Office in those days, today's Dicastery for Doctrine of the Faith, as liaison to the German church. He had been following the ecumenical movement that had been active for half a century among Protestants to heal the divisions among Christians. So he heard this second thing, a renewed cordial invitation to Christian unity, and he got busy behind the scenes. By the end of 1959, Pope John made him a cardinal. Here's Augustin Bea. Made him a cardinal. So he had easier access to the Pope. On June 5th, 1960, when both men are 79, Pope John announced the various commissions for the council, and among them was a secretariat for promoting Christian unity, and Cardinal Bea was named as its president. So that's how active he was behind the scenes. Not only would this council be ecumenical in the sense of being a universal, global Catholic Church council meeting, but it would also, in some way, include other Christians in its deliberations. Enter Jules Isaac. Only 8 days later, June 13th, for a private audience with Pope John. Isaac reports that Pope John told him that as soon as Isaac, walked into the room, Pope John said, "Oh, I ought to have him talk to Cardinal Bea." Isaac was a Shoah survivor, and he hid out in the mountainous areas of southern France, and he read and studied in this hiding place, and came to the conclusion that the Holocaust came about because the centuries of church teaching of contempt for Jews had created among the population the right attitude for the Nazi government to nearly exterminate all the Jews under its control. And he asked Pope John, do something about the contempt of the Jews. Form a commission. And Pope John said, I think you can hope for more than you imagine. I want you to see Cardinal Bea. And then so Pope John, June 5th, announces the meeting of John the 23rd and Jules Isaac on June 13th, 8 days later. 2 days later, the meeting between Isaac and Bea. And then Bea waits until September when he meets with Pope John, at which time he said, yes, we'll also do, besides Christian unity, relations with Jews in some way in the council. And when Augustin Bea, the president of the Secretariat for Christian Unity, presented the first draft of what would be Nostra Aetate on November 18th, 1963, he was the last one of the three still alive. The other two were dead. That's how fragile this text was in getting on the agenda. And it was under much threats during its existence in the council agenda. The Secretariat for Promoting Christian Unity had responsibility, full responsibility for three documents of Vatican II. A decree on ecumenism, the declaration on the relation of the church to non-Christian religions, Nostra Aetate, and a declaration on religious liberty. Cardinal Bea knew and had learned that anything the Catholic Church said about ecumenism would not be believed by Protestants unless we said something about religious liberty. The official position of the Catholic Church, of the Holy Office, up until Vatican II was the best state is the state with one religion, and that religion is the Catholic religion. And we Catholics were forbidden to attend ecumenical events here in the United States, where faith and morals were discussed, and were discouraged from attending prayer services in other churches, and even engaging in prayer with Protestants and others. And at Vatican II, this was reversed. Catholics were urged to participate in ecumenical prayer services and to have a change of heart towards other Christians. And they were also taught not to look down their noses at other religions as wrong, and as Judaism as a failed religion, but to look upon the followers of all religions with respect. So, why are we celebrating a 60th anniversary for this one of the three documents? Well, take a look. As soon as this took place, 1964, the decree was brought out in the third period of the council at the end. There also was a directory that was on the agenda that was brought out, and then a revised directory of ecumenism came out in '93. The Pope, John Paul II, wrote an encyclical on ecumenism, 1995. The Secretariat produced recently the Bishop in Christian Unity and Ecumenical Vademecum, a handbook on ecumenism in 2020. It's real easy to read. It's written for bishops, so it's Vademecum. The Bishop of Rome, Primacy and Synodality in the Ecumenical Dialogues and in the responses to the encyclical Unum Sint, and all the texts from various ecumenical dialogues, agreements on Christology with all the Orthodox churches, and the 1999 Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification. We're looking at where we are now in Christian unity. We're not looking, okay, it was wonderful we had the decree and their principles, but we've moved well beyond. And why not the Declaration on Religious Liberty? Well, it represents a set of principles, but it was once and done. It was once and done. And it became part of general Catholic social teaching. But to understand why we're here, it might be good to look at how this text got out of Vatican II, to look at the history. At the Secretariat's first plenary meeting in November of '60, there was a 10th item on a 10-item agenda, questions on Jews. Latin was the working language of Vatican II. The Secretariat for Christian Unity used French as its working language. So it was Questiones Hebraeorum, is what it was in the Latin. And by the way, the texts in Vatican II, the official texts are all in Latin. So whatever translation you're given is an interpretation. It's not the official text. Oh, but this is from the Vatican website. Well, the official text is Latin. And so keep that in mind as we look at this. After a while, in the months before the council met, the Secretariat prepared a draft on Jews. That was the title, De Judaeis. There was a meeting of the Court of the Central Preparatory Commission in June of 1962 to prepare the agenda, but a few days before it, the World Jewish Congress, which Cardinal Bea had consulted in the early days for advice on interacting with Jewish agencies. How do you pick who's the people to talk to? I mean, if you know anything about Jews today, there's a variety of agencies, a variety of points of view, and no one speaks for everyone. The World Jewish Congress announced that an Israeli official, Cham Vardi, the Minister for Christian Affairs, was going to be their observer at the council. He would be the observer for the organization. But the only delegated observers inside the council were the Christian representatives of other churches. There weren't, how do you pick which Jews come in? The guests could come in, but there weren't any observers. Well, when word leaked out that this little upstart secretariat was going to write a document on Jews, Arab and Muslim leaders around the world got worried. This council is looking at Jews, and in a lot of parts of the world, Jews and Israelis are interchangeable. That means this council is going to recognize the state of Israel. This is 1960s, 1948 establishment. And there was a huge diplomatic crisis. You got a minister from the Israeli government going to be an observer. And Cardinal Cicognani, this Vatican Secretary of State, looked at Cardinal Bea and said, we can't do this text. You got to take it off. We got a mess on our hands, a diplomatic crisis. So it was removed. So for the whole first period of the council, it was removed. No discussion in Aula really about Jews and Jewish relations took place. And when that ended in December of '62, Cardinal Bea wrote a memo to Pope John, and he said, I really think we could do a purely religious statement on the church's relation with Jews. And he wrote over the memo, go ahead. And so the Secretariat met, and they more or less took the old draft, but they gave it a new name. On the relation of Catholics to non-Christians, above all to Jews. And it was chapter 4 of the Decree on Ecumenism. Chapter 5 was on religious liberty. And it was presented in the Aula in November of '63. The presentation to the council, the bulk of the discussion took place on ecumenism. The bishops just ate it up. They loved it. I worked very closely with an American who was there. He was 30 years old, an American, a Paulist, Father Thomas Stransky. And he said, we were timid. We used the word dialogue just 3 times in the text. And they loved it. And so that was the first time the word dialogue appeared in a high magisterial text in the Catholic Church, referring to how we interact with people of other faiths and with other Christians. The first time. And it was only a draft. So it came well ahead of Ecclesiam Sum, Pope Paul VI's encyclical on a church in dialogue. They didn't discuss very much the chapters 4 and 5. But Cardinal Bea said, don't worry, not discussed, not off the agenda. So the Secretariat met in March of 64, thought about adding a paragraph on Muslims, but decided to drop the idea. They submitted on Jews, somewhat reworded from the previous November, and then Cardinal Bea lost control of the draft as the Central Coordinating Committee began to work on it, requesting changes and accepting suggestions. Even Pope Paul VI got involved. He had been elected as a replacement for John the 23rd when he died in May of 1963. So he proposed that silly, on the relation of Christians to Jews and the universal human family. I mean, they were just going wild. They even had to make a list of all the drafts floating around. Wait a minute, now we got this and this. They moved paragraphs around. They reworded some sentences. They asked for Bea to write a new sentence on Muslims. So he had the experts there. And then they put the draft together. And then they decided, well, this is not ready for voting. This is all new. The decree on ecumenism, the first 3 chapters are ready. So we got to take these 2 things on religious liberty and the Jews out. We got to take it out and we got to make them declarations. So they created a new category. A declaration is a piece of a decree that was taken out because it's on a very specialized topic. And there were 3 of those at Vatican II. And these were 2, religious liberty and Nostra Aetate. And St. Paul, in his letter to the Romans, which was moved forward as the key scriptural text, his mature theological text, when he worries and anxiety about his people, Jews, worries. Many did not accept his preaching that Jesus was the Messiah. But he had hope in God. God will not forsake his promises, that in some mysterious way, in the final fulfillment, quote, all Israel will be saved. Israel, the people of God, all Israel will be saved. Well, that was changed in the wording to the union of the Jewish people with the church. Jews and Christians together, striving together, very prophetic line, to union of the Jewish people with the church. And on either side were these pleas for dialogue. And Jews said, and then a copy was leaked to the press. People were working against it. Jews got very upset. Oh, so you're doing all this because you want a dialogue, because you want to convert us, right? It became despite the changes and the mess. And Bea had to write a letter to the Secretariat bishops, the bishop members. What you see and get in the mail is not what you voted on, but maybe we can work it out. And despite the changes and the mess, when he got up to the podium in September of 64 to present it, he got a standing ovation. It's against the council rules. Hey, stop. They were just clapping all over the place. And he presented it. He spent a lot of time talking to them about the term deicide. The killing of God, which doesn't make sense, deicide. But it was a charge that Christians had hurled against Jews for centuries. And it was in an earlier draft, but it wasn't in this one. Should it be back in? What about the concept? He had a lot of time talking about that. And the majority of interventions were expand the text. We need more on Muslims. And the bishops of Asia and Africa said, we want stuff on the religions we're dealing with. And so 2 things were clear when he sat down. He got another standing ovation when he finished. 2 things were clear, maybe 3. One is Bea would never lose control of this document again, and he made sure of that. Secondly, it had to be expanded. And thirdly, the Secretariat had become the darling commission of the council. The bishops trusted it. And you'll find all kinds of people who were at the council said, this Secretariat for Christian Unity, more than the doctrine on the Commission on Faith and Morals, or the Commission on Missions, or the Commission on Worship, more than any other, understood the vision of John the 23rd, was at the heart of it. So the expanded text returned 6 weeks later for a vote. 6 weeks later. The expanded text on the relation of the church to non-Christian religions, November 64. That's Nostra Aetate. it begins with those words, in our time, or in our age. Nostra, our aetate, time or age. In our time, when day by day, humankind, it's how it begins here. Compare my translation to this from the Holy See. In our time, when day by day, humankind is drawn closer, ever closer together, and the ties between different peoples are being strengthened, the Church examines with greater care her relation to non-Christian religions. You should know that this draft is the product of 3 drafting committees. It was in 5 numbered paragraphs. The unity of humanity and profound enigmas of life. The big questions in life. What is the meaning of life? The meaning of life in terms of those who acknowledge a transcendent dimension to life that they experience and maybe call this God as we do. These questions, death, what happens after death? The religious responses to this in reference to a transcendent being, in reference to God. And Hinduism and Buddhism are named. And then Catholics are urged to recognize, preserve, and foster what is true and holy, and to dialogue and collaborate with these followers of other religions. That was done by 1 drafting committee. There was another committee of experts on Islam who did number 3, and the original drafting committee did 4 and 5 on Jews and on the rejection of discrimination. And then the Secretariat wove it together. It was a very, very highly well done operation. Our focus this evening is primarily on relations with Muslims and Jews. So, part 3. Part 3 on Muslims used language that would be immediately recognizable to Muslims. It was written by people who had spent their life looking into these questions. So, God, the one God. The Church regards with esteem Muslims. They adore the one God, living, merciful, self-subsisting. They submit wholeheartedly to God's decree, like Abraham, with whom their faith is gladly linked. So they're linking their faith to Abraham. They revere Jesus as a prophet. They also honor Mary. They look forward. Mary's the only woman named in the Quran. They honor Mary. They look forward to the day of judgment. They worship God, especially through prayer, almsgiving, and fasting. You can read the whole big first chapter in there. The passage, the lines are then followed by an understatement. I think the greatest understatement at Vatican II. In the course of centuries, there have indeed arisen not a few quarrels and hostilities between Christians and Muslims. Then the passage concludes with this sentence. But now, this sacred synod pleads with all to forget the past, to make sincere efforts for mutual understanding, and so to work together for preservation and fostering of social justice, moral welfare, peace and freedom for all humankind. When the Vatican Council uses an expression, this sacred synod pleads, or the Church therefore exhorts, for example, or exhorts her sons and daughters to recognize, preserve, and foster what is true and holy in other religions. The Council Fathers intend that what follows is to be taken seriously. Very serious. And this language is in all the documents. Now, although the concluding passage does not specifically say dialogue, dialogue is implied on how these efforts for mutual understanding will unfold. What does not seem entirely insightful is the wish that we forget the past, which we know we can't do, right? Middle East is a good example of that right now. Decades later, Pope John Paul II will speak about the healing of memory, by which he meant recovering the painful memories of the past, acknowledging them together, and then to begin a healing of memory. And I've always thought, this was his World Day of Peace message for January 1st, 2002. The January 1st World Day of Peace after 9/11 and the terrorist attacks of 2001. There is no peace without justice, and no justice without forgiveness. And I have often thought that this line was meant as a correction to forget the past. Pope Leo, on September 12th, made a video message for an event that was at Lampedusa, the island with the immigrants and refugees. Gestures of Welcome was the event, in which he said, "There is no justice without compassion. There is no legitimacy without listening to the suffering of others." And those of you who've read Alexite, his apostolic exhortation on poverty, can see his logic here. Okay, now, while the text uses language familiar to Muslims, it does not mention their two most important beliefs, the Quran and Muhammad. The drafters were very clear why they could not mention both beliefs. It would have taken considerable space to write descriptions acceptable to Christians and to Muslims. And most likely the descriptions would not have been considered adequate by Muslims, so it would have been offensive. The Secretariat wanted to keep the document brief as possible because these were radical shifts in teaching. And so they're not mentioned. And you also notice that only 3 of the pillars of Islam are mentioned here too, for these very same reasons. So there are shortcomings. I mean, it has faults, well known. Paragraph 4 on the Jews, paragraph 4, essentially accomplished 3 things. The spiritual bonds between Christians and Jews are unbroken and continue to hold. Jews are not collective, so that's the first point. And they talk about all the spiritual bonds that we have. They're multitude. Jews are not collectively guilty for the death of Jesus, and God does not repent his gifts or revoke the calls that he makes. He does not revoke the calls that he makes. In other words, the covenant. And thirdly, Jews are not a rejected or accursed people by God, and the church decries or deplores hatreds, persecutions, and manifestations of anti-Semitism directed against Jews at any time and by anyone. So it accomplished 3 things. It addressed the teaching of contempt. It talked about our bonds are strong, and it repeated that Jews are not guilty collectively for the death of Jesus. In 1960, to remind Catholics that Jesus, his mother, and the apostles were Jews was news to most of them. Because we thought they were all former Jews. Can't really be a former Jew anyway, if you're born of a Jewish mother. But somehow, the passage draws from St. Paul's Mature Theology and Epistle to the Romans, giving priority of place in the New Testament, in which he comes right after Acts of the Apostles, in which he examines with great anxiety the plight of his people. And he recognizes the great heritage of the Jewish people and God's enduring love for them, despite his experiences that many did not agree with his preaching about Jesus the Messiah. Paul expressed this eschatological hope that God will provide an opportunity for the Jewish people and the church to serve God with one accord. Earlier drafts used deicide and deicidal people, but it didn't appear in there. People were angry about that. We should name it. Some bishops said you have to name it and then condemn it. And Paul VI says, I don't want it in the text. It's an ugly word. And I don't want us using the word damnat to condemn. This is not a condemnatory council. It doesn't fit our language. It's a council of exhortation. Nor does the word Israel appear in the text. lest there be some misinterpretation that this was a political document. So not even in reference to the people of God, Israel. It says, this text denies that the church is rejecting all forms of anti-Semitism for political reasons. No, it's not doing this for political reasons. The gospel requires Christians not to hate, not to persecute, and not to discriminate. And paragraph 5 widens this. So the text does not refer to contemporary Judaism. It's dealing with Jews of the past. The primary purpose was to correct past teaching, and it's doing that. When it finally, then they voted on it, and then they put it off for a final vote to 1965. And when they, there was still some disagreement on the changes, but when they took the final vote on the day it was promulgated, opposition to the text dwindled to only 88 votes, with 2,221 council fathers approving the text. The Asian and African bishops said, we don't have Jews in our countries. I mean, they're still dealing with biblical Jews. It's a challenge that Rabbi Noam Meirens is talking about now with the American Jewish Committee. We have to think about where there are Catholics, where there are no Jews living. And we have to somehow find a way to correct that. So, but Paul was really pushing for this. So in 64 on Pentecost Sunday, in between the first two sessions and the last two sessions, he established a secretariat for non-Christians, another secretariat. So that after the council, it will carry on this work. So he was saying, we're going to pass this text and we're going to have a secretariat that will implement it. And so the bishops from Asia and Africa had asked for this, so they were placated. There's a group of hardliners from the Curia, a small minority of council fathers, including several members of the Roman Curia, with leverage to disrupt the process, and almost did several times. They were cautious and worried about the effects of too much change and the political impact on the public forum and spiritual challenges to Catholics of this text. So they could not be placated and probably made up most of those 88 negative votes. The major holdouts were the bishops of the Middle East and the patriarch of the Melkite Church, Maximus IV, who Pope had created a cardinal in 1965 in January, was their leader, and he threatened, if this comes up for a final vote, we're going to walk out. Paul VI didn't want that. The theme of the council was on the church as it is, and the church in the world. Can't walk out. I mean, terrible thing to do. Through the hard efforts of Cardinal Bea and his staff and the support of Pope Paul, who wrote to each of the bishops, they were all visited, they heard their complaints. In the Middle East, religion and politics are tightly intertwined. The separation of church and state is a principle of our democracy and a hard-earned arrangement for European societies. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and the subsequent war with neighboring Arab states had ended in a bitter stalemate. This was 1965, before the 1967 war. Somehow they convinced them, okay, this is a Western idea. We know it's not true in the Middle East, but we're going ahead with this. They gave in. And so there it is. So 16 documents of Vatican II, 4 of them in the red are constitutions, 9 decrees in the black, and 3 declarations, and the year that when they were voted on. So in 11 of them, 12 of them were voted on. 11 of them were voted on in 1965 in 3 batches. So Nostra Aetate was the first batch at the end of October. There it is, Declaration of Relation to Non-Christian Religions. Then Divine Revelation, 3 more 2 more in November, and at the end, the last 4. And note, the decree on the church's missionary activity comes later. And that caused a problem. When the full-blown text was presented in November of '64, the principles for missionary activity were presented for debate, and it went ugly. The missionary bishops said we need to change our approach. We need to go and engage the people of Asia, Africa in our missionary settings. We need to do all we can. This is a matter of working in partnerships. This is not putting everything there for conversion of people to Christianity. But the Curial staff for mission in Rome said, no, other people are potentially baptized Christians. And so this debate carried on well after the council and was never really resolved. So why a 60th anniversary, a mid-20th century document, all that we said? A constitution. It's a set of principles, a set of precedents for application to come. A point of no return after 60 years. We're not going back to before Nostra Aetate. In that sense, Jews consider it a gift. It had many unanswered questions, much unfinished business that we talked about, the relation of dialogue and missionary activity, the salvific role of other religions, the Quran and biblical revelation, the role of prophecy and prophets. You know, there are terms like revelation and prophet that mean different realities. They have different meanings for Muslims and for Christians. So you just can't use the words simply. You've got to constantly kind of work your way through discerning what's understood and what's not understood. The relationship between the 2 covenants, the promise of the land and the state of Israel, the church and the Shoah. All of that was yet to come. An artist sort of did this scheme of Paul VI with religion. You see Mohandas Gandhi there. He wasn't at Vatican II. And Archbishop of Canterbury, who came a little bit later, Ramsey. And there's Athenagoras, who embraced him in Jerusalem. So Cardinal Pignedoli, who was the second president of this Secretariat for Non-Christians. And John Paul II changed the name. Let's get rid of the non-language. Nobody's a non-person. So we're going to call it the Secretariat for Interreligious Dialogue, or the Dicastery for Interreligious Dialogue. To help things along, Paul VI created 2 commissions in 1974, 9 years after its promulgation, with Judaism, or Jews. I've seen the title in 2 official texts, and with Muslims. For religious relations, the Secretariat of State deals with political relations. We're going to try to work with religious relations. And that commission set off. They did guidelines right away, then notes on the correct way to present Jews and Judaism in preaching and catechesis, 1985. Every generation needs a new one of these. Every generation needs to relearn. Because we find that anti-Semitism doesn't go away, does it? It keeps coming back. And so every generation needs to think about how we're going to present and preach about Jews and Judaism. We remember a reflection on the Shoah came out in '98, which somewhat good and somewhat not so good. The gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, a 2015 text. One of the biggest development is when Jewish agencies got together and created the International Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations. We call it IJCIC. It set up a mechanism so it could meet in dialogue with Catholics. John Paul II went to the Synagogue of Rome, the first pope to do so, in 1986. Rabbi Tuohy. There he is. The Jewish religion is not extrinsic to us, but in a certain way is intrinsic to our religion. So this is one of John Paul II's statements. Judaism is intrinsic to Christianity. Well, we could talk about that for a long time. A covenant never revoked. That's what he said. Another, I think the Assisi World Day of Prayer for Peace, that painting came alive, but it's John Paul II. This was the greatest implementation of Nostra Aetate to date, and it's 1986, when he asked religious leaders, on the one side, the representative of Constantinople, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The other side, well, there's the Dalai Lama. It should be really a Muslim, but you got the Dalai Lama, I guess. The Christians went around one circle, and Rabbi Tuohy was opposite the Pope. And the people of other religions around the other way, and two Crow medicine men were at the end of that one from the United States. And it really affected John Paul II. At Assisi, in an extraordinary way, there was the discovery of the unique value of prayer, that prayer has for peace. It is seen that it is impossible to have peace without prayer, the prayer of all, each one in his own identity, and in search of the truth, in deepening what we have said, one must see in this another wonderful manifestation of that unity which binds us together beyond the differences and divisions which are known to all. Every authentic prayer, every religious person is under the influence of the Spirit, who intercedes insistently for us because we do not even know how to pray as we ought. But he prays in us with unutterable groanings, and the one who searches hearts knows what are the desires of the Spirit. And that's a passage from the letter to the Romans. We can indeed maintain that every authentic prayer is called forth by the Holy Spirit, who is mysteriously present in the heart of every person. Extraordinary reflection. Even Pope Benedict got into the act and celebrated the 25th anniversary, and there they all are walking together in Assisi. Pope John Paul II had two other Assisi events, in 1993 during the war in the Balkans, and in 2002 after 9/11, and then the 25th anniversary with Pope Benedict. So the Dicastery for Interreligious Dialogue produced documents, but they're all on mission and dialogue. And actually, the one in 84 is the best, and they kind of deteriorated from there because everybody wanted to get into the discussion. But one of the great gifts of this was that as 1984 was approaching, the 20th anniversary of the creation of the Secretariat for Interreligious Dialogue, they asked missionaries around the world, what have we learned in 20 years of interaction and dialogue? And they collected this information, and they said, there really are four kinds of dialogue. There's a dialogue of life that all of us live, where we strive to live in open and neighborly spirit with others. The dialogue of action, where we join together with others for social welfare, for the liberation of people, social projects. The dialogue of theological exchange, here's where specialists talk about our faith to one another. And the dialogue of religious experience, where persons rooted in their own traditions share their spiritual riches. Each of these can be extraordinarily profound. Finally, in 1993, the State of Israel was recognized, and some people call this Nostra Aetate 2.0. I'm not so sure, but it allowed diplomatic relations. It allowed Pope John Paul II to visit the Holy Land, and his famous prayer that he put in the wall. God of our fathers, you chose Abraham and his descendants to bring your name to the nations. We are deeply saddened by the behavior of those who in the course of history have caused your children to suffer. And asking forgiveness, we wish to commit ourselves to genuine brotherhood with the people of the covenant. And the Shoah, Pope Benedict, Pope Francis. When Pope Francis went to the Holy Land, he took his favorite rabbi from Argentina and his favorite Muslim leader, made a special thing. Would that every bishop had a best friend among his friends, a rabbi. They're not just acquaintances. They talk. In fact, he called him in Argentina the night he was elected, Rabbi Skorka, the night he was elected Pope. And then Pope Francis began signing joint declarations. So let me go to the the last one here. Why a 60th anniversary? Pope Francis began to talk about accompaniment. Let's not talk about dialogue and proclamation and mission. Let's talk about accompaniment and encounter. So for all the reasons we've said so far, Nostra Aetate was an act that became an opportunity to embrace past failings and to recognize one another as gifts and to be a blessing to all. And I think that's why we're still celebrating it among all 16 documents of Vatican II on its 60th anniversary. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. One more round of applause, please. At this point, I'd like to invite my colleagues up, Noah and Zeki. We're going to be joined now. Please have a seat, and I'm going to say a few words about you. We're now joined by two colleagues, both faculty members in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and members of the Executive Committee for the Tuohy Center for Interreligious Understanding. Dr. Zeki Sertoprak is a scholar of Islamic theology and mysticism and the author of at least 4 books, including Islam's Jesus and Islamic Spirituality. He holds the Nursi Chair in Islamic Studies and is the chair of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here at John Carroll. Dr. Noah Bickart, who holds the Mandel Chair in Jewish Studies, is a scholar of rabbinics whose wide-ranging research includes the scholastic culture of the Babylonian Talmud, including the interesting intersections of Christian and Jewish cultures of antiquity. Let's welcome them. I'm going to take a seat here with these guys. You know, John has given us a lot to think about, so I wonder if he could offer some initial reactions to his remarks. And my understanding is that Zeki will be going first.
Okay. First of all, John, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. It is a very important document. I totally agree. It is a change in the relationship between Muslims and Christians. Before that, there was no such a relationship. In fact, as John mentioned, a Catholic could not go to an interfaith gathering because it would be against the teaching of religion. Now, in the Quran, in Islam, for example, there is an invitation. It says, O people of the book. The Quran describes Jews and Christians as the people of the book. O people of the book, let's come together that we worship only God. So it's inviting the people of the book, actually, coming together. So the message that Nostra Aetate speaks of about Muslims, I would say, as John mentioned, like it is mentioning 3 articles of faith in Islam, maybe 4, because I counted a little bit. You could argue that it speaks of 4 articles of faith. Believe in God, which is very essential. Believe in the prophets of God, which is giving Abraham as an example, but Muslims have to believe in Jesus, have to believe in Moses. It's a part of Islamic faith. Believe in the afterlife, because Muslims have to believe in the afterlife. There is life after this life. So this is a very important step, but I would say, because I don't like to go too much, I like to give time for my colleague Noah. I like the last statement that John mentioned. It is a document to be finished. We need more. And I think we will work on this to make it more and become closer to each other and become cooperating and making alliance for the future of humanity. In my book, Islam Jesus, as my colleague Mindy mentioned, I argue that the future of humanity is in cooperation between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. If they come together, they can make peace in the world. Because they constitute more than half of humanity. Big part of human civilization and human population. They can make a big change. And that's why they should come together. They must come together to work for peace in the world. Thank you.
Noah?
So obviously Nostra Aetate is important to me personally. If it weren't for Nostra Aetate, I don't think I would have this job here at John Carroll University. And it's a job in which, yes, I'm a professor of Jewish studies and I teach classes. I see many of my students in the room. But it's also the kind of job where I'm invited to say a prayer at the Mass of the Holy Spirit every year. And I go every year with my tallis. And that is something that's sort of unimaginable in the pre-Vatican II world. It's also a big part of my teaching. Every spring I have the honor of teaching the capstone seminar for theology majors. And we read Nostra Aetate, and also we read Jewish responses to Nostra Aetate. I assigned two, a lecture given by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, at Union Theological Seminary in 1965, which is called No Religion is an Island, in which he really doubles down on, I think, much of what we've sort of talked about this evening, where Heschel says, yes, Jews and Christians share so much. Yes, please, let's engage with one another. But I also teach, and I want to emphasize this, the response of Joseph B. Soloveitchik, who is the head of Yeshiva University, who gives a lecture called Confrontation. And confrontation is sort of Soloveitchik's no thank you to Heschel's yes please. And Soloveitchik points something out which I think is really, really important to keep in mind, and I want to show you how there's a little bit of a problem in Nostra Aetate in a second. But Soloveitchik reads the two stories of the creation of the first human being in the book of Genesis, that which occupies most of all of chapter 1 and the very beginning of chapter 2, and that which occupies chapter 2, to sort of say that these two kinds of creations of the human being mean that there are sort of two ways in which Jews see themselves. On the one hand, Jews see themselves as human beings and responsible to God in the same way that everybody is. But the Jews are also doubly confronted with a kind of profound particularism. Judaism, unlike both Christianity and Islam, is not a universal religion. The ideal world for Christians is one in which everybody is a Christian. And we'll see this in the document itself in a second. The ideal world in the world of Islam is a world in which everybody is a Muslim. Jews really are dual covenantal theologians. In synagogues around the world, last Saturday we read the story of the flood, and when Noah and his family get off of that boat, there seems to be a covenant made, which later Jewish tradition sees as with all of humanity, and that would be the category into which Jews place Christians and Muslims, right, as heirs to Noah's covenant, a universal covenant. But of course, Jews see themselves as bound by the covenant at Mount Sinai, which is a particular covenant, one that not all human beings are called to observe. This is a particular one. Maybe the hardest thing for me to get across to my students is this fundamental difference, therefore, between Jews and Judaism and Christians and Muslims. There's another difference, of course, worth bearing in mind, which is that Judaism isn't really or only a religion. So much of the documents we've seen on the page are sort of struggling. Are we talking about Jews or are we talking about Judaism? and this sort of ethno-nationalist identity, whether it's with regard to Israel-Palestine questions or simply just questions of racism or identity, those are slightly different categories from those of religion, and Jews don't quite fit. So because I'm a Talmudist, bear with me now, and let's look at the text of Vatican II, because I just want to point out a little bit of an internal conflict here, just so that we can sort of keep our critical ears perked. So we don't have page numbers here, but if you look at the paragraph on Jews and Judaism, which begins with number 4, so the very last line of that page in number 4, indeed the church believes that by his cross, Christ, our peace, reconciled Jews and Gentiles, making both one in himself. It seems like the position of the Catholic Church is that somehow Jews are inseparable from Christians in some real way. Okay? Jews are a part of Christianity. Christians can't tell the story of Christianity without first telling the story of Judaism. But Jews don't think that way the other way around. You can perfectly well tell the story of Jews and Judaism without making any reference to Christians or Christianity. Indeed, Christians and Muslims are in the sort of all other category. So that's one thing. If you look at the next page, okay, in the second paragraph there, the second sentence, God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes or of the calls he issues. Again, quoting St. Paul in the letter to the Romans chapter 11. What exactly are these gifts and what exactly are these calls? If God is calling the Jewish people to a particularistic covenant, well, does that make Christianity a dual covenant theology in which the Jews have Judaism and everybody else has Christianity? It would seem that that line maybe leads in that direction. But if you look at the next paragraph, in the second sentence there, although the church is the new people of God, well, wait a second, right? The Jews should not be presented as rejected or accursed by God, as if this followed from the Holy Scriptures. Okay, so Jews aren't to be fully rejected, and yet, in some sense, the church has also kind of replaced Judaism. Right? And we see that sort of doubled down on at the very bottom of the page. Christ underwent his passion and death freely because of the sins of men and out of infinite love in order that all may reach salvation. Seems like that is opposed to a dual covenant theology. It would seem like the Catholic Church is available to everybody. So we see a sort of internal tension in this document. Either God wants all people ultimately to be Christians, or God wants Jews to be Jews. But you can't really have it both ways. And that tension, I think, is one that continues to sort of agitate Jews to this day. It's something, I think it's a productive tension, certainly a productive tension in our classrooms. But is it possible for Christians to see Jews not as an intrinsic part of themselves, but as a real other that is autonomous? And my sense is that the answer to that question is no. And therefore, there may be ways in which dialogue between Jews and Christians is complicated as a result of this internal tension.
Thank you. John?
John, would you like to respond to that?
No, well, is this on? I think it's on, is it? The tension is there, for sure. And I think the first line is there because for centuries we taught a replacement theology. And so even though it says this is not to say, so we do consider ourselves new people of God. We do think that we have a new covenant. But that doesn't mean, and the tension is, that the old covenant has gone away. And that doesn't mean that Jews are not the people of God. And I think this is closer to the reality of what Nostra Aetate was beginning to say. I didn't use the line that I had in the text. I think at the time of Vatican II, most of the bishops really didn't know what dialogue was about. Even Paul VI. I think Paul VI, he wrote a whole encyclical. He used the word 70 times in his church, in his encyclical Ecclesiam Suum. And I think deep down inside, he believed that once we have dialogue in earnest, that people will begin embracing Christianity. I even think, you know, most bishops didn't have, were they thinking when they came home from the council that in our ecumenical teaching through dialogue, we're going to grow together with other Christians, or would they return to the Catholic Church? And I think it took about a generation for it to kind of seep in that we were, even Pope John the 23rd did a little statement right after he was Pope. And he read a few lines when the Archbishop of Canterbury visited him on the sly. And he said, you know, and he read it, and the Archbishop said, well, not return. We're going along parallel paths, and in God's good time, we will recover our unity. And Pope John said, I think you're right about that. In other words, we had to rethink what this was about. So, and so it seems to me that what Pope Francis got along with is said, look, we've been looking at this whole complicated thing of mission and dialogue and intrinsic and all of that. Let's just accompany one another. Let's become friends. Let's get to know each other as friends, as spiritual companions on the journey. And then he started doing, like with Imam Al-Tayyib of Al-Azhar University, he did this extraordinary statement on human fraternity that nobody could have imagined would happen. I mean, but two men were looking, both of them were looking for some opportunity. We know Al-Tayyib was, because he said to the president of Georgetown 20 years ago when he visited in Egypt, he said, oh, I'd love to do a program for you, but not yet. We're trying to find something. Well, he did it with Pope Francis. And Pope Francis went on and did other things in Indonesia, too. I didn't show the picture of the imam kissing him on the top of the head after their joint statement. In other words, let's embrace the complexity of what this is about. I think, you know, it is unfinished, deeply unfinished, but that's why we're still talking about it, because there's something there we want to say, I think. By the way, that line, the 2 into 1 from letter to the Ephesians, that's on the model of Georgetown University. You shall make the 2 one. The reference there is to the north and the south, by the way. But how we used it, but it's that. In other words, I once asked Fitzmyer, Joseph Fitzmyer, the great scholar, Jesuit scholar on Epistle to the Romans. You use this line, Paul's former co-religionist. What do you mean? I think it's a very good line. Were they former co-religionists? I don't think his anxiety that he has in Romans is about co-religionists. And we're all co-religionists in some way. We're all companions. So I won't go any further. There's others who probably want to speak.
Well, that's a great segue. We'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. We don't have a lot of time, but we do have a little bit. And we have some mics if you need them, or you can shout it out.
I had come to one of these events maybe 20-some years ago, and the bishop who was presenting was on the same line and was talking about the ecumenical meetings of the minds and so on and so forth. And one of the ladies who happened to be, I believe, Hindu, asked him, how can we be, you know, why are we not equal considered? And the bishop, I believe he was from Africa, and he said something that has stayed with me and that bothers me to this day, that how can we be equal when Jesus, Son of God, is our Savior, and you just have ordinary people. So that sense of better than the others, how has the Catholic Church moved forward since that time, some 20-some years ago?
Well, if the question was about why Nostra Aetate doesn't say much about Hinduism, I mean, it just names it, and one line on Buddhism. They put this together in 2 weeks, and Cardinal Vienna, Koenig, was somewhat of a scholar. And he said, there's a Jesuit from the Indian bishops who's here, and he can help us. And there's a Jesuit from the Japanese bishops, and he can help. So they just kind of got a line. And they had put something in about what you have in Africa. And Missionary of Africa came for drinks with Father Stransky at the Paulist House. And he said, can you give me a line about the kind of spiritism that's going on in Africa? Sure, I'll come back tomorrow for another drink and I'll give you a line. So that's how it was put together in a way that we want to open it, but we don't want to say everything. We can't say much. But just say, and they felt like they had to name Hinduism and Buddhism because they're very identifiable traditions around the world. Now, I don't agree with the writing. When Pope John Paul came to this country in 1987, there was a big interfaith gathering in the Japanese section of Los Angeles, Little Tokyo they called it. And the head of one of the Buddhist churches was there. And everybody was there, and the Pope, and Hindus, and Jews, Muslims, Jains. And the Buddhist churches in America person said, this reminds me of a Japanese proverb, everyone has a mother and I like mine the best. We have our theologies, all of us do, that we bring with us when we encounter. And it's a matter of working and interacting with one another so that we truly understand what we're trying to say and how we believe. And I think the encounter that takes place among scholars and among people who are very depth at spiritual guiding have added a lot of nuance to our interactions. So with Christianity, we're trying to resolve a scandal of division. Interfaith dialogue goes by a different dynamic. And I think accompaniment is the best answer that I've heard, that we've been saying now since Pope Francis has been Pope.
Zeki?
Yes, I think I like that Japanese proverb, everybody has a mother, and I like my mother the most. Actually, in Islam, there is a verse in the Quran, it says, O human being, we have created you from a male and a female. And we have made you into nations and tribes so that you know one another. So based on these Quranic verses, actually our mother and father is the same. We have the same mother. All humanity has the same mother. Because all humanity is created from a father and mother. That is the teaching of the Quran. And therefore, yeah, we love our mother the most, but also we have larger one, that is, we have one mother. All of us have one mother. One father and mother. And that's why when it comes to the concept of racism, there is a teaching of the Prophet, it says, all human beings, when it says there is no superiority of an Arab over non-Arabs, and over a non-Arab over Arabs, and all human beings are from Adam, and Adam from soil. So your essence is from soil. All of you are from soil. No superiority of one group over another. All human beings are like the teeth of a comb, the Prophet says. Like the teeth of a comb. All human beings are equals in the sight of God.
Do you want to respond to that? All right, great. There was another question. Oh,
There are two questions. One.
okay.
This is more an observation, but the phrase "in our time" appears. It strikes me that that's very much like a Jewish teaching of Lador Vador, from one generation to the next, and that it's an invitation to renew this kind of thinking, this kind of coming together, and it must be done in each time. So I take sort of issue with the second statement that the document is to be finished and completed, because it can't be completed. One generation's statement of it is not going to be sufficient for the next and the next and the next. So I guess I'd like to turn this to it as an invitation to each of you, if you have any thought about what should the next version of this look like.
Well, I'll make one point, which we've danced around a little bit this evening, is that so much of Nostra Aetate is implicitly a response to the Holocaust, right? In which the Catholic Church, almost uniquely among Christian denominations, saw what had happened in Europe and looked inside itself to look at the ways in which church teaching was related to what had happened. I wonder where we stand now vis-a-vis the Holocaust. This is something the Jewish community in America and around the world is grappling with. For a long time, the kinds of things that all Jews could agree on, and Jews don't agree on anything, right? The things the Jews could agree on are the state of Israel and the importance of the Holocaust. And those two things are not quite the pillars of agreement that they once were. And I wonder if we have moved to a place in which the Holocaust no longer hovers over all kinds of Jewish-Christian encounter, in that maybe we are in a different time. And maybe that changes the way in which we relate to one another. There's certainly, I certainly feel a kind of confidence to point out the ways that Jews and Christians, while they may share Scripture in common, they read that Scripture so totally differently. I have a kind of confidence in asserting that in ways that I'm not sure Jews 60 years ago felt so confident. And so I wonder if we're really in that same time, or maybe we're really in a new age that we can reimagine the ways in which we interact with one another.
Well, strangely, this has gone really, really fast, and we're actually almost out of time. But we can do one more, or if either of you would like to respond to that, both of you?
If you want to respond.
Very, very briefly, yeah, it is not completed, it's not finished. We have actually something called Muslim-Catholic National Dialogue. Muslims and Catholics nationwide in America coming together annually. It's very fruitful. So they told me that there is similar with Jewish-Catholic dialogue as well. I think these type of things will make people closer to each other. They will, as the Quran says, they will know each other. And then once they know each other, they will have much more communication, much better communication. And maybe in the future, they will make alliance, coming together and making our world in a better place. Because before, you know, if you don't come together, if you don't speak to each other, you'll never make progress for the future of humanity. And I think these are good steps. It's not completed. And if we need to have another document, maybe in 2030 we'll have another document. I don't know. But it is needed. And I think one aspect of it that was mentioned, spiritual renewing, if we can a little bit focus more on spirituality of these religious traditions, we will have much more common ground and coming together.
There was one question there, but I guess it's too late now.
Yeah, well, actually, I imagine the panelists will welcome some further conversation for those of you who would like to follow up. But for now, please join me in thanking our panelists. I want to particularly thank Dr. DrBorelli for making the trip out to Cleveland for his remarks.